Hello, Ivy here. This week's podcast is entitled Community Knows First, SGUK episode 173, Introduction. This podcast brings attention to the significant support to abuse victims by grassroots organisations. We will also touch upon why early intervention rarely starts with law or police. We will look at some of the barriers within the legal systems that prevent effective early intervention and how community-based organisations address these challenges. The SGUK campaign encompasses many survivors of coercive control abuse around the world, mainly women, and who cover a wide range from affluent to the opposite end of that spectrum. We also looked at community groups in 2022, supporting victims in a variety of countries, and we are currently researching if they are still in existence and updating our records, ready for when various task forces are formed, commencing with a leading global task force to be formed and named in the future. This task force will comprise of leading professionals, community organisations from a variety of nations around the world, specialist consultants, human rights groups and organisations, elected members from a range of countries, authors who have researched and written about this area of abuse, former politicians, survivors of coercive control, university research professionals, law enforcement, and many, many more. The organisations that the SGUK volunteers and I contacted are both large and small. Some you will all instantly know of, and others, some of you will be hearing about them for the first time. This piece of the jigsaw is an outline of community groups and larger organisations based in several parts of the world, and the work that they do, and who the survivors approach for assistance and support to venture into the complicated world of the court system. We will also touch upon, in a future episode, the treatment of women going through that court process, which is more like a racetrack littered with hurdles, many of which are difficult to cross. Things have improved over the years, but there is still a long way to go. Currently, any coercive violence committed prior to 2015 is proving to be very, very difficult to be recognised in the court system. That cannot be accepted and will continue to be challenged until that marker in the sand is removed. Just because abuse prior to that date was called something else does not mean it did not take place. Education is paramount and will no doubt feature heavily in the coming months and years. This next paragraph is an abstract from a much longer article, and as usual, the reference source for that and many more things in this week's podcast is listed at the end of the article. This paper presents us a review of 22 published evaluations which examined domestic abuse interventions across the UK. A literature search was conducted in November 2016. The main aim of the review was to identify emerging good practice in multi-agency early intervention. Thus, to be eligible for inclusion in the review, projects were multi-agency in nature and aimed to intervene early. Findings from the review reveal that there are a range of strategies and interventions that have been piloted and tested which have had varying degrees of success. Overall, interventions that adopt an advocacy approach appear to have more impact and are more sustainable, and that when co-located with statutory or voluntary services, multi-agency working is enhanced. However, further consideration is required in terms of what constitutes early intervention, as all interventions are dependent on victims and perpetrators. Accessing services early. Thus, primary prevention strategies, currently entirely school-based, are key to promoting and supporting secondary prevention. A case study. There are many, many more in the reference sources. This is just one example. For over 2.5 years after I left the relationship, I was stuck in a hell from which there was no escape. My self-confidence and self-esteem were virtually non-existent. I was encountering severe feelings of loss and stuck in depression. Whilst I recognised that these were the psychological injuries sustained as a direct result of the abuse I had endured for 15 years, I found myself having to relive all of it every day, as I was fighting to see the kids and trapped in a wholly unsympathetic legal process of divorce. The lack of understanding of coercive control within the entire legal system was inadvertently allowing my partner to continue to have an impact on my daily life. However, as I received one judgment or decision after another, I began to feel a sense of closure, however small or short-lived. I was still reliving the abuse daily, but because of the closure, I was less anxious about daily activities and chores. The depression felt it was moving on, and the feelings of loss were moving to the next stages. And then something happened. Another person came into my life. Before the abusive relationship, I always regarded myself as a positive, creative, principled, loyal, empathic person. And here now was I, felt was my perfect compatible in every way. And yet, whenever I was with this person, I found that despite their incredible reassurance, I could not help but feel an overwhelming anxiety. When I was not with that person, there was a battle going on in my head. I was picking flaws in this person. All those incredible qualities this person possessed and shared were now in my head coming across as needy, possessive, and manipulative. And subsequently, this person who I originally felt was beautiful physically and emotionally was now beginning to look unattractive. Something inside was setting off alarm bells. Something was wrong, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and my behaviour around this person became cold and aloof, and I was beginning to push this person away. The question lingered, why am I feeling like this when that other person has not given me any reason to do so? What's triggering these feelings? Every day I would put these feelings and thoughts through a cognitive process, weighing up the qualities of this person against what I was feeling. I discovered that there was nothing, neither a proportionate or justifiable reason, for me to feel what I was feeling and thinking. So I accepted that this person was my physical, emotional, and intellectual compatible, and then moved on to understand why was I trying to push this person away. The answer made me aware of the extent of the abuse I had encountered and its deeper and longer-term impact. I was scared, pure fear, not because of anything this person was saying or doing. No, it was the feelings that this person was bringing to life, which in the previous relationship had been played with, manipulated, and tortured, leading me to live in constant daily fear. Not necessarily the fear which comes from the potential physical threat, but similar in intensity. The fear I would feel when I would cook their meal, fearing that it will not be good enough, that my cleaning will not be good enough, that my appearance will not be good enough, that my family and friends would not be good enough, that my job, thoughts, ambitions, and feelings will not be good enough. I was living in fear every day. The fear was protecting me. It would make me prepare for the next abuse. It would make me think ahead and try to preempt my partner's moods. The fear was protecting all those thoughts, feelings, and belief systems I had made, which made me who I was before the controlling relationship. Now, here was a person who shared those thoughts, feelings, and had the same belief systems, but I found myself fraught with anxiety, shutting this person out because they were triggering that fear. Now I understand that I could apply a cognitive process to help me realize that this new person did not warrant the thoughts and feelings which I had become hardwired over the 15 years of abuse to protect myself. I had to relearn and recondition my thoughts and feelings. I was always good at learning something new. I could feel that this was going to be difficult. I had to work on my self-confidence and self-esteem whilst being aware that if any feeling or behaviour was out of character, I would have to address that feeling or behaviour, recondition my mind, and unlearn all that had been imposed upon me. I could feel that this would take a long time, but my kids and my happiness was worth the battle. End of quote. If the victim is able to escape the environment that they have been in, they will remain impacted by the abuses. And this next few lines is in bold. It is likely that even when the victim has escaped, the victim will continue to be coercively controlled. This can happen by the further manipulation of the perpetrator of the institutions and organisations such as the police, lawyers, welfare services, and courts. End of the bold section. By making counter-allegations, including alienation from the children. Hence the victim might continue to live in fear under the shadow of the perpetrator. There is more on that section. That's just basically bullet points of major things to look out for. But you will find in the reference sources, whenever, if ever, you choose to look at those in the future, that will explain and give more examples, other people's experiences, and it will start to become clearer. So, signs to look out for. Isolation. The abuser may isolate the victim from friends, family, or support networks, making them dependent solely on the abuser for validation and support. Micromanagement. Constant monitoring of the victim's activities, such as their whereabouts, spending, or interactions, can be a sign of coercive control. Manipulation. This can take various forms, including gaslighting, making the victim doubt their own perceptions, guilt-tripping, or using threats and intimidation. Financial control. Controlling the victim's finances, limiting access to money, or sabotaging their job or education opportunities are common tactics. Emotional abuse. Verbal insults, degradation, and undermining the victim's self-esteem are all part of the emotional abuse that often accompanies coercive control. And I would like to point out here, and in some of those bullet pointed headings that I read out earlier, should you come revisit and come to look at this article where you can read this and more for yourselves, I would say when you look at, as I said, the headings, signs to look out for, those kind of things, I want you to just spare a small amount of your time putting an example of a famous person who is instantly recognizable around the world. And when you have a figure like that, that you immediately know who that person is, and you know some of the things that have happened to them. In fact, you probably know most of what's happened to them, but there's not necessarily that they've all come forward in your mind as being, yes, that's what happened. So here, I'm giving you an example of Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, because she's a well-known figure, and if you have any kind of doubts or difficulty in understanding how these things are, one, abusive, two, the impact that they have on people at various stages. Different people are affected by it at different time scales, but they are ultimately all affected by most, if not all, of these things. Certainly half to most. There are some people out there that have been affected by all of them, and Meghan is one. And research that I did as part of a number of projects all connected with the book, I was shocked to see from various authors, various specialists, listing what they considered to be signs to look out for in terms of coercive control. Clearly, all of them had most of those headings, but there were some that had additional ones or subheadings to any of those. And when I was going through them, and each time I came across a new specialist and went down the list, whenever I found a new one that hadn't cropped up in previous list, I then thought, actually, that was done to Meghan. That happened to Meghan. Meghan experienced that. And truly, by the end of this part, time spent on researching that on and off over the years, over the 8 years, that I've eventually had such a build-up of a database, cross-mapping, and when in the image that I then put together with a female in the middle, which depicted Meghan, and I put that it was Meghan, I just looked at all of these, if you like, speech bubbles around her with these headings, and to think that one person experienced so many things, all depicted by these, if you like, speech bubbles. And the reason for that is because the abuse has gone on for years. Otherwise, it would have probably been the standard ones that came through, which were still bad enough. But there were so many there. And I just thought, what an indictment on all of the people and groups who are part of and who I have made a point of explaining in graphic detail in the research and in the reports that I've done and named the groups that I'm talking about. They should hang their heads in shame. No one person should be under that type of pressure daily, let alone for 8 years and still going on. And I'm sure there are a few people around the globe in various countries who are in that position, who are probably wondering, how on earth has this come to this stage? But when someone is in the public light, they also attract a frequency from the same, I won't use the word to describe the various groups, but you know who I'm talking about. Their day will come, it has to. You cannot do that to another person and feel that that's okay. You just can't. And I hope that one day, even if it's a small amount of the evidence that's been gathered, is discussed in a court of law, certain people need to be worried. And I'll leave it at that. So just going through this signs to look for, it just reminded me of that particular day when I realised all of these various professionals listing signs to look out for, where I said most of them were in agreement anyway. They were the standard ones that come up. But when you looked at all the random ones from all of these people that were putting their expertise forward, there was Meghan in the middle of all of this, who'd experienced all of them. And I'm quite certain there's more that I haven't come across yet, but I've come across a fair amount. It's beyond disgusting. It's beyond cruelty. And all of those that are responsible for it, many of whom feel they're in protected positions, they're wrong. In the research and also putting various podcasts over the last few years together, based on this area of work, I've focused particularly in the podcasts on USA and the UK. That's not to say that there are other countries we know, because I've got various groups from various countries that are part of the research and crop up in various pieces of literature over the years and will be put forward to various other groups of interested people in years and months to come. But I used the USA and UK because that is the biggest base, if you like, of the followers in terms of where they are currently living, and it makes it easier to pull and collate figures together. But believe me when I say that, because we have got a number of groups, organisations, community-based organisations in many countries, and the beauty of that is that when these task forces start, it begins with a global one and then it'll spread out from there. But when that gets underway, which will commence in the next few months, when that gets underway, there is opportunity then to gather data from these various countries, their data that they've been collecting in a variety of establishments, and pull that together so that there becomes a global database of this kind of activity for adults and children, because we have lost children along the way, along with adults that are no longer with us, due to this kind of behaviour. And it's a way of putting together a global database without having to start from scratch. There is no need. There are so many organisations out there really, really working hard, collecting data, and it's about pulling those together and also their expertise and their experiences into one central place that then can be used as our evidence base moving forward in a variety of cases which I'm sure will start to emerge. The figures are getting more collated, better collated, the volume of them is increasing. It's early days yet, but we have to start somewhere. And knowing that there are groups out there, both in USA and UK and around the world, who have been collecting data, but the things are not described as coercive control and other phrases used for different elements of abuse. And my feeling on that is it doesn't matter what it was called, it took place. And it's been taken place for hundreds of years. And the majority of it is against women. That also needs to be a separate research project. But what I'm saying is there's a way of getting global data pulled together, not just from the last few years where it's officially recognised in the courts now in the UK. And to be fair, although it's recognised as of 2015 onwards, no other country has got that as a database, as a date, a marker in the sand that they will recognise it from that date. And anyway, the majority of all of the community groups and some of the lawmakers, but that's about education in terms of the lawmakers and for their understanding of what coercive control is. But there are people around the world who have been working with various forms of abuse for a very long time, and people before them who are no longer with us, but their work has been left behind, so we have all of their research papers and books and so on. And I'm of the opinion, and I'm not alone, that just because it was called something else 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, does not take away the fact that the abuse took place. And that's the point that I am and have made in my writing and in my publication, or publications, is about that. Yes, 2015 is a start, but by no means is that going to be left like that, because there are still people walking around, survivors of abuse, and to tell them in so many words, because of how the legislation is set in the UK at the moment, well, we can't do anything about it because it took place before 2015. That's not going to fly. And the more countries that get on board and understand that, and they will, because there are people, I said, walking about who are survivors, and it didn't just take place in the last few years. It's been going on some time, and you can't and should not just dismiss that and say, sorry, that's too early, that took place too long ago. We only count from this date. That's where we're at the moment. It's a start, because there wasn't a date at all until 2015, but they're going to need to go back a lot longer than that. And the evidence is there, and the evidence and descriptions of what was done in these various forms of abuse. And it is, in many, many cases, coercive control, but it's not described as that in decades and hundreds of years prior to that. But the point is, where there are survivors now, it's a lot longer than 2015. And justice will be served. both to them and to the abusers who think they've got away with it. In the article, there are a number of organisations in the UK and USA based who are there to give advice and to point you in the direction of services that are near to your home or in a place where you wish and feel comfortable to go and see someone in those organisations. So although I've got a few of them in the article and I've named some of the others in terms of a link to their website, I'm not going to read out all of those now, but just so you know, there are a few there from both USA and the UK, but there are clearly a lot more because each of the nations have got their own set of organisations out there waiting to help. But I couldn't list all of those. I've got one here that is a UK-based one in Kent, and there are telephone numbers and tells you where the place is. I've done the same with USA ones with phone numbers and locations and so on for you to seek help. And even if that is not your area, which clearly is not going to be for most of the people coming forward, but each of those in their respective countries will be able to point victims in the direction of somewhere that is convenient for them to access. In conclusion, coercive control is a serious issue that can have devastating effects on victims. By understanding the signs, seeking support, and raising awareness, we can work towards creating safer and more supportive communities for everyone. If you or someone you know is experiencing coercive control, remember that help is available and you are not alone. Here's one of the charities I've listed. As I said, there are a few in the article, but there are so many of them. There are more listed in the reference sources, but even that is a drop in the ocean. But it gives you an idea. They're out there. And the idea of this podcast was not to focus on the larger, well-known organisations, not because they're not doing it, they're doing a fantastic job. But when someone is a victim of abuse, including coercive control, they tend to, first of all, not tell anybody about it, sometimes for years. And when they do speak to someone, it may be a friend or someone that has picked up that something's not quite right with that individual and will coax them into sort of telling them a little bit more. And then you find, from what they've said and from the things that I've been researching over how many years now, they find that there are small community groups in their area or near to where they live, not too near, because sometimes they don't want to be round the corner from where the abuser may see them coming or going from that building, as just one example. But the idea of this podcast is because so many of the survivors of this awful, cruel treatment said that they went to, when they eventually decided they needed to seek help, they went to or were referred to community groups. They were smaller, they lived in their area, they were specialists in this field, and also they met others that were survivors. And the stats show that the majority of people who do end up going to court, usually not succeeding because of how things are done in the legal process against women generally, but certainly in the area of coercive control, where there's no physical bruise that they can see or injury, the research shows that the majority of people go to a community group much, much earlier and stay with that community group longer, and then a few move on to the actual legal process. And that in itself is painful to research as to how women are dragged through court after court after court. It takes so long. It also costs a lot of money the longer they drag it out. And so some people just, one, either can't afford anymore, or just get worn down by the different hurdles put in their way, and also at the end of it, no confidence that they're going to succeed. I've certainly read of some, including one from the UK, that was so upsetting, where the woman came away with nothing, and the abuser was the one that was doing all right, Jack. It was really, really cruel. And it was just basically a lack of understanding of what this is. Just because you haven't got a broken limb and you haven't got cuts and bruises every day does not mean you are not being abused. So, going back to this, the reason for this particular podcast as part of this series, there are no more coming up that, apart from this series that I've got, a few of them, they relate to things that have already been researched and recorded in the publication, but also, more importantly, more linked to the information that will go to the task force and the spin-off task forces that will flow from that, and together with human rights organisations and all of that. But it will be a global thing. So the reason for this is just one, the research has been done already, and I wanted to explain and just explain to people, here are some reference sources if you wish to know more about this in the future. Here's a good starting point. There's a few here. Community organisations, are very, very important to survivors and for people who are going through into this survival mode every day just to get through another day. Those groups, many of whom are operating on a shoestring, they're there for these people all the time. And they're like these hidden angels that you don't really know about because you don't have a reason to go and be with groups dealing with this. But they are a lifeline to survivors, and they deserve recognition. So one, I wanted to do a podcast on it on the back of the research that's already been submitted and written about these groups. We had already a long list, 40, nearly 50, it goes about 47, 48, something like that, community organisations that we had listed in 2022. Some of those are no longer with us because they've run out of funds. One of them, the founder of the organisation, sadly passed, so that organisation didn't and couldn't continue. But that particular list of groups, we're going through a checking at the moment just to see which ones are still there, and because they knew it would be some years before we'd come back to them because of how this was all set up and how we did our research. And that existing group, that will still be there, and what we've done now is expanded it, and we are looking at the really small community groups out there that are unrecognised. Most people don't know they exist, and to have that list added to the list of community groups that we looked at in 2022. And those will be put forward as a starting point with the permission of those groups, because we'll ask them before we do it, one, do you want to be on this list? Are you happy that we're going to put it forward and try to get resources and so on for you? But it won't be working with the SGUK volunteers and myself. This now will be passed on to professionals. It goes from there to professionals and to spin-off groups globally. It does not involve us anymore. That is the idea. No one is going to be targeted the way certain groups went for any kind of good work done by squad members. That won't be happening here. The kind of powers that we're talking about, they won't be even thinking about, let alone trying anything with any of those groups. It would not be wise to do so. But this podcast is in honour and recognition of community-based groups working with clients, doing wonderful work, and it's about raising their profile and hopefully getting some resources for them in due course. So this one is just one. Survivors' Voices. Who are we? Survivors' Voices is an abuse support survivor-led organisation that turns the pain of abuse into power to improve responses to trauma. We work with survivors of all types of abuse. We are all experts by experience. That's crucial. A community of volunteers, freelancers, workers and advisors from a variety of backgrounds. Our vision is for a safer society with support for survivors that is survivor sensitive, survivor empowering, and services that are trauma responsive. Then there's a list of what they do. I'm not going to go into that. I have put brief outlines against each of the groups that they've got. For example, they've got peer support, research data. We research survivor experience of abuse, safeguarding, help seeking and recovery. We develop tools to support good involvement of survivors in research and education, including our Survivor Charter and Research Involvement Ladder. We can help you to engage well with survivors in your research project and recruit participants and peer researchers through our linking services. They have a group on education and training, on activism, what's that one? Resources. They do a lot of survivor-created writing, research and resources for survivors, allies and those who work with survivors. And they have a mailing list that you can join and be updated on the rest of current projects. Like I said, they're so impressive. These are just tip of the iceberg that are in the article, and a few more in the list of the reference sources. But truly, once you start to look, you will see other links that come up. And there are groups based in every country, or at least most countries, I'm sure. And we are going to have task forces that will be linking in with those professionals, those groups on the ground, those community groups doing wonderful work behind the scenes and making that link to the global task force, which will be gathering the data to feed back out to all those organisations where resources exist and where they can apply for and will be approached by various bodies who can help in some way. Reviewing results. A couple of years after it was enacted, the UK government called for a review of the coercive control behaviour law in order to determine whether changes to the legislation or wider policy interventions were needed. The resulting review was published in March 2021, and while citing a short implementation period of the law, 4 years included in the review, and a lack of data, it drew several conclusions. The review found that as people acclimated to having and applying the new law, police records of coercive control behaviour offences and prosecutions significantly increased each year, showing that the law provided an improved legal framework for dealing with coercive control behaviour in the criminal justice system. Recognising that the number of coercive control cases were still well below other domestic abuse-related offences, the review concluded that because a pattern of abuse, multiple incidents, is required to be considered coercive control behaviour could not be accurately compared to other domestic violence offences which relate to a single incident, such as an assault. The article ends with a table of the types of offences that have gone through the courts in years 2016, 2017, 2018 and 2019, and all of the types of the breakdown of coercive control, and they have increased in each of those years. Today, by coincidence, someone sent me a link to, it must be the same organisation and group that did this, because it's set out in a similar way, where the years are listed, and it goes up to, I think it's 2023 or 24, I think it's 23. So there's another 4 years on top of this one. So I haven't looked at the table yet, because someone sent me the link to say, oh, there's been an update on those figures that you had. So I'm interested to see whether or not it's continued to increase, and whether that means, it must mean that there's more understanding of what coercive control is in the legal system, and hopefully the figures continue to increase over the next 4 years, on top of what the 4 years are in the article. So I will put that table together. It will be a slide in a future podcast, but I'm just going to say this relates to episode 173, just so you know where it's coming from. Because I am interested. I didn't know they'd done another set. I hope they had, but I didn't know. But I said, someone kindly sent me the link today, and I thought, oh, so they have done another 4 years. So we'll see. And I'll put something around that, even if it's just a flyer that goes out. It may not be it won't be a podcast just on this, because we've done one today. But I will probably put a flyer out that just says, as a follow-on from episode 173, here are the latest figures, and I'll put these first 4 with them as well. So you won't have to go back to the podcast or back to the article to find it. I'll put all 8 years in that flyer, and you can have that as sort of information to see how the UK is doing. I'm hoping that definitely more countries will come forward. They're certainly talking about it. I know that the state of California has got something in since 2015 that is similar to the UK one, because they refer to the UK legislation. Not quite the same, but it's very, very close. Apart from California, I don't know how many other states are doing the same. They've got legislation, but it's not as precise as the one in the UK and the one that's currently in California. But it will come, because it has to. There's just no way that you can sort of just stay in the background and just let other states try and help their residents and people that live there. So, just to say that table exists in the article for those first 4 years, but I will send out an update probably over the next couple of weeks for you to follow that through. To bring this podcast to a close, I'm just going to read out a few bullet points of resources available to victims of coercive control. And this is by a community group, a USA-based community group, and it's a USA-based community group resource centre. So it covers a number of smaller community groups. And it's, I think, a nice way to end this particular podcast. And as I said, I will update the table, that's the last slide for this podcast, going up to 2019. There is another set of figures that has now come out, going up to I think it's 2023 or 24, and someone sent me a link today to say that the figures had been updated. So I'm going to put that updated table together with the one that we've got in the article and in the podcast slides in one place, just as a flyer. I'm not going to do a podcast on it. I will send that out in a flyer for you to just keep as information. But as I said, we'll end today's podcast on these community groups, doing a grand job out there. And this is about a community groups resource. So it's key resources available to victims of coercive control. 1. Counselling and therapy. Professional counsellors skilled in the strategies of coercive control can help victims understand their experiences, build self-confidence, and find strategies for emotional recovery. 2. Legal support services. Legal aid organisations provide assistance with protective orders, custody, and other legal matters for victims of coercive control. 3. Support groups. Connecting with others who have experienced similar situations provides emotional support and shared wisdom. 4. Emergency helplines. Many organisations offer 24/7 helplines, providing immediate support, safety planning, and connection to local resources. 5. Education programmes. Courses like our Coercive Control course educate survivors on recognising coercive control and accessing available resources. And it closes with Family Violence Mindset Solutions provides guidance on how to access these resources and build a support network. Learn more about resources for navigating and escaping coercive control. And we'll bring this podcast to an end. Just to say and to remind from a point I made earlier that this covers UK and USA, just for analogy really, and to explain what resources are there at that kind of level, who then can spread out and give you resource information and links to community organisations in your locality. And it seems a fitting way to bring the podcast to a close. In the reference sources, there's a paragraph there from one of the community organisations, and it's headed up Remembering Dr. Evan Stark. And I thought it was so appropriate, so powerful, and the amount of work that he has left behind, publications, several years worth, gold. And there's so much that he did around coercive control, and we lost him just over a year ago, and I certainly wanted to include something in this podcast around that. Evan Stark's work has had a profound impact on our understanding of domestic abuse and coercive control. His research and advocacy have helped shed light on this often overlooked form of abuse, paving the way for better support and legal protections for victims. Following his recent passing, let's honour his legacy by continuing to raise awareness, and support survivors of coercive control. And that's the end of the podcast. I'll need to say no more following on from that. So, it's bye from me. Bye from Ivy. Bye.